Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 75. It's our 75th birthday in chronological order if you're following along or scoring at home, which if you are scoring at home, God bless you. With our book today, the inspiration for movies, plays, short films, and even a deep inspiration for other books within its own genre. This book stands as the opener to our month-long exploration of what science fiction and fantasy literature can teach us about leadership in life. The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, by J.R.R. Tolkien. And we're going to take this book on today with our returning guest co-host from episode number 57, where we covered the tragedy of Othello, and where we talked about all things William Shakespeare, Ryan J. Stout. Say hello, Ryan.
Hello, Ryan. Thank you for having me on, as usual. Fantastic.
It is going to be a great day, and we're going to take a little bit of a journey here, and we're going to start off by going to an unexpected party featuring Longbottom Leaf. By the way, I'll have the Longbottom Leaf he's smoking. Chapter 1 from The Hobbit, by J.R.R. Tolkien, An Unexpected Party. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel, a very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The Hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on and on, going fairly but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as all the people for many miles round called it, and many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then on another. No going upstairs for the Hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of these. Wardrobes. He had whole rooms devoted to clothes. Kitchens, dining rooms, all were on the same floor and indeed on the same passage. The best rooms were all on the left-hand side going in, for these were the only ones to have windows, deep-set round windows looking over his garden and meadows beyond, sloping down to the river. This Hobbit was a very well-to-do Hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but because they also never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. This is a story of how Baggins had an adventure and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighbors' respect, but he gained, well, you will see whether he gained anything in the end. The mother of our particular Hobbit, what is a Hobbit? I suppose Hobbits need some description nowadays since they have become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. They are or were a little people, about half our height and smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There's little or no magic about them, except the ordinary everyday sort, which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly when large, stupid folk like you and me come blundering along, making a noise like elephants, which they can hear a mile off. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colors, chiefly green and yellow, wear no shoes because their feet grow naturally leathery soles and thick, warm brown hair like the stuff on their heads, which is curly, have long, clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and laugh deep, fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now, you know enough to go on with. As I was saying, the mother of this Hobbit, of Bilbo Baggins, that is, was the fabulous Belladonna Took, one of the three remarkable daughters of the old Took, head of the Hobbits who lived across the water, a small river that ran at the foot of the hill. It was often said in other families that long ago, one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That was, of course, absurd, but certainly there was still something not entirely Hobbit-like about them, and once in a while members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. They discreetly disappeared, and the family hushed it up, but the fact remained that the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, although they were undoubtedly richer. Not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. Bungo, that was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, and partly with her money, that was to be found either under the hill or over the hill or across the water, and there they remained to the end of their days. Still, it is probable that Bilbo, her only son, although he looked and behaved exactly like a second edition of his solid and comfortable father, got something a bit queer in his makeup from the Took side, something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived until Bilbo Baggins was grown up, being about 50 years old or so, and living in the beautiful hobbit hole built by his father, which I have just described for you, until he had, in fact, apparently settled down immovably. By some curious chance, one morning long ago in the quiet of the world, when there was less noise and more green, and the hobbits were still numerous and prosperous, and Bilbo Baggins was standing at his door after breakfast, smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes, neatly brushed, Gandalf came by. Gandalf. If you had heard only a quarter of what I have heard about him, and I've only heard very little of all there is to hear, you would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place wherever he went in most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down that way under the hill for ages and ages, not since his friend the old Took died. In fact, and the hobbits had almost forgotten what he looked like. He had been away over the hill and across the water on business of his own, since they were all small hobbit boys and hobbit girls. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, born January 1892 and died September 1973, only a couple of days before this recording, was the author of works of fiction that would come to be regarded in time as high fantasy and would serve to stand as the platinum standard of fantasy writing in the 20th century and well into, and I believe will stand for the remainder of the 21st century. After serving against his will in the trenches of World War I, most notably at the Battle of Somme, he moved into a professorship from 1925 to 1945 as the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon and a Fellow of Pembroke College, both at the University of Oxford. J.R.R. Tolkien was an Oxford man, which means he was a British man with class. Now, Tolkien was a close friend of the Christian apologist, who used to be an atheist, C.S. Lewis, and was a co-member of the informal literary discussion group, The Inklings. Now, C.S. Lewis wrote The Abolition of Man, which we covered on episode number 61 of this podcast. I would encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. Lewis took a little bit of a different view of his experiences in World War I than Tolkien, but much like Tommy Lee Jones said in No Country for Old Men, and I've mentioned this before on the podcast, Tolkien and Lewis both saw the same things, and they both came to similar conclusions about human nature, about warfare, and about the transcendent. Now, Tolkien's academic career and his literary production were deeply influenced by his studies in language and philology, curiously enough similar to Nietzsche. He specialized in English philology at the Oxford University, and in 1915 he graduated with Old Norse as his special subject. And so language, location, geography all come together in not only The Hobbit, but also subsequent books, which we will cover this month on the podcast, the trilogy that you all know and love, The Lord of the Rings. Now, according to the New York Times obituary, following his death in 1973, quote, Tolkien never expected his stories to become popular, but by sheer accident, a book called The Hobbit, which he had written some years before for his own children, came in 1936 to the attention of Susan Dagnall, an employee of the London publishing firm George Allen and Unwin, who persuaded Tolkien to submit it for publication. And after that, it was off to the races. The Hobbit, of course, gave birth to the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It gave birth to the Silmarillion, and it gave birth to the entire thing that has folded out over the course of the 20th century. Matter of fact, many times in the 1960s, 1970s, and even into the 1980s in the subterranean train stations and the subways of New York City. You would see the graffiti that would say, Frodo lives. So I can't think of anybody better to talk to about the nature of hobbits, and the nature of heroism, and the nature of getting out on the road than a man who even discussed with us on the road than my good friend Ryan Stout. So Ryan kind of introduced Mr. Bilbo Baggins there to the listeners. And of course we live, 20 years after Lord of the Rings trilogy films came out from New Line Cinema. Books that, quite frankly, up to that point, I thought were unfilmable. I literally thought they could not be turned into cinema. Or if they were going to be turned into cinema, they would only work as animation, right? Like it couldn't work any other way. And Peter Jackson, of course, proved me wrong, and the country of New Zealand proved me wrong. All right. Well, so I want to ask this question to start. Have we just read too much of Tolkien already?
It's amazing. As doing that awesome introduction and that excerpt, kind of a lot of things are popping in, and it's funny. I started to take notes yesterday, and it like turned into an essay, and I was like, I don't know if this is so. It got me looking into the abolition of man. Okay. Mm-hmm. Pons Asinorum. Mm-hmm. And the learner is incapable of learning more. And so Tolkien writes about in fact, your description of Bilbo right out of the gate, Tolkien's description of Bilbo right out of the gate, sets the premise for the whole thing.
It does.
And he has a growth mindset. He needs to be sort of convinced and jarred a little bit, but once he's kind of all in. There's some reticence along the way, of course, because of, things are difficult or whatever. But, I think that is, I think people see that and they can relate to that. I know that Tolkien was very specific in saying that he's like, it's not allegorical. And it doesn't need to be because the characters are rich. I look at Tolkien, people may scoff at this, but I mean, sort of in what, I don't want to say what they represent, but the value that they potentially have in one's life. Okay. Kind of like the Bible. It's there, it's reliable, the stories are great, and there's a lot of wisdom that could be sort of gained out of it. And it's timeless when it comes to that. And I don't think people are, similarly to the Bible, which I think they've sold a few copies of that book, similar to like you can pick it up and almost flip through and get to any scene, and you're going to have some information that has the ability to sort of enhance your life on some level, because it's so relatable. So that's, and I also kind of went into what's also supporting that is we're kind of in, that's 19th, 20th century literature. We're kind of in contemporary. We're in the contemporary stage or contemporary period of literature, but there's also this like postmodern contemporary literature. And if you look at like Dan Jalisco's like House of Leaves, where there's 3 storylines and the book is actually textured, and also books like Maggie Nelson's Bluets, which is a book of kind of like segmented paragraphs that kind of that loosely tell a story, but it's more to kind of like evoke a feeling and take in more than what's actually written on the page. It's kind of like a full experience. Those books, that style, that format, they're kind of like mirroring the social schizophrenia that has come out of kind of like media consumption. And I started to think about how authors from the 19th and 20th century literature and modern day authors, for the most part, have lived very, very, very different lifestyles. And mainly the main point is So the main difference is that most, if not all, contemporary American authors have a black obelisk machine in their pocket that knows everything forever.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have that kind of like power or access to information, I think and I don't say the social schizophrenia as a disparaging term. I think that's how humans have had to evolve to deal with the amount of information. I think it's if we didn't evolve, if we don't evolve with it, then it will, like, other things will consume us. So I think it's grounding, and I don't think, and I just he sold Tolkien has sold enough books to give one person who lives in America and Europe one book. Over 600 million.
So, okay, a couple of things there. So I'm aware of contemporary authors. I wouldn't be doing my job if I weren't, right? But on this podcast, we tend to read authors from the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century. We tend to stay in that sort of range, because I think there's some value in the long slog of the Enlightenment. And I don't necessarily mean from a philosophical perspective, although there is much value to be gained there. I believe that the almost 400-year slog of the Enlightenment has provided treasures that we have not fully mined, because we look at it as passé. We view it as passé because of that rectangular obelisk or that square obelisk in some cases in our pockets. And so when we talk about them living different lives, I absolutely agree. So how do we take, and this is one of the struggles of this podcast, this is one of the massive struggles, how do we take not necessarily just the lessons, because we started with the lessons, because I think there are lessons, and we'll talk about leadership in a minute here. There are lessons that we can take from these books that apply, because human nature fundamentally, I don't believe, shifts regardless of the technology. We're still going to have, you talked about the Bible, we're still going to have greed and lust and murder and talking bad about people. Like, they were doing that back in biblical times. They were doing that in the 17th century. They're doing it right now on my block somewhere, and they're going to be doing it 300 years from now. Like, those things don't change, right? That's the core parts of human nature. The arrogance of our time is because we have that obelisk in our pocket, we think that we've somehow changed human nature. And the tragedy is we haven't. So the struggle of this podcast is to sort of pull those lessons about how to deal with that, how to navigate that, how to even conceptualize it for people who maybe are looking for something more than what they can get from just the internet. The Hobbit speaks to actually all of Tolkien's writing, but specifically The Hobbit speaks to some of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, Tolkien said he didn't expect this to get published.
Right.
What was his intention? His intention was to entertain his children.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a very pure and I don't know, sort of like, it seems like very careful and love filled. And I don't, and yeah, you're right. It's a fine line. How do you tease out, and how do you say modern sort of intentions don't mirror that? In the sense of restate the question.
So The Hobbit, when we look at The Hobbit, there are universal themes inside of The Hobbit. And we'll explore a few of them today. But the biggest one, and it is one that we will talk about probably extensively, is this idea of getting out of your comfort zone and going on an adventure, but then being able to face the dragon of the adventure, and in some cases, the literal dragon guarding the gold, and being able to take that back and being able to reintegrate that into your life. This is almost Joseph Campbell story of myth, hero with 1,000 faces kind of stuff, right? Carl Jungian, the Jungian journey of personality, right? How do we reach into the Hobbit and pull that message out? How do we pull those themes out for folks who, quite frankly, are probably going to want it in a tweet, or in a TikTok video?
The yeah, it's a lot of, yeah. Okay, I see the conundrum. Yeah, it's how, yeah, because it's a lot of it is like fundamental. How do you fundamentally shift how people receive information or can even receive information? Some people probably don't even know they can read, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's
Right.
just, it probably doesn't. It's you know it probably, a lot of people, reading really doesn't even enter their daily activities.
Right.
And so there's this sort of like inherent, or like you said, it's a 1 or 2 word tweet. I think, like, for rereading this or reading this, and how little things, like when he's talking about like what the cram is,
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
what it's, there are these brief, there's a sentence or two peppered throughout the entire book that make it feel conversational.
Mm-hmm.
And he even says, when I laughed at you, is like, he kind of breaks the fourth wall.
Mm-hmm.
See if it, how it turns out for him. And there's this playfulness. And so, I mean, how to, I mean, it's isn't it it's kind of like why all art is suffering, or I mean, the theater is suffering, or it's because we as a society devalued anything that's not transactional,
Or
or
or has utility,
yeah.
or has
uh,
immediate utility. Yeah.
and so it's, I mean, how do you, it's 600 million copies over almost, like 70 years. It's like the is that enough evidence? But no one really cares about evidence anymore.
Right.
There's so it can have a tremendous, I was talking with a friend last night, like, it's so, getting a job in the post-COVID world has been bananas. Going
Right.
into bar, hey, here's my resume, and people were like, yeah, I don't care. It's I'm gonna take I'm gonna hire the hot girl.
Mm-hmm.
People being like, telling you that, like, I don't care about your accomplishments. I'm gonna hire the hot girl. And you're like, okay, cool. So what am I gonna have a sit down and comb through tomes of information with this person who just made a decision and said this? You know what I mean? Like, it's a
Right.
psych, it's like a psychic block, and it's like just another, like another sort of evidence of the spiritual malnourishment that we all seem to be sort of like engaged in, whether and that's the onslaught of information of what's keeping that barrier from uh interest, if people sort of like grabbing onto it, is how do you bridge the chasm?
Yeah. Well, I'm reminded of a line in The Gunslinger, by Stephen King, um, where the wizard Martin is finally captured, or not captured, but Martin Broadcloth is finally run down by the gunslinger. Um, and and of course, The Gunslinger by Stephen King, the book opens up with that great first line. The man in black raced across the desert, and the gunslinger followed him. And then you're sort of, it's sort of call out to the Hobbit, right? You have this layered sentence where there's a whole bunch of different things happening, and then you sort of go. But anyway, so spoiler alert: the gunslinger captures the man in black, the wizard. Anyway, and they're holding palaver, right, over a fire, and Martin Broadcloth, the wizard, tells Roland Deschain, the gunslinger, about the history of Midworld, right? All the things that happened before the world, quote unquote, moved on. And one of the things that he tells Roland, he's not an intellectually smart man, but he is stolid and persistent, which is what you need in order to go to the tower. You need that. You don't need to be particularly intelligent, but you need to be persistent, right? And he gives him information. And he tells him that at one point in time before the world moved on, men were even able to make babies with frozen man sperm and were even able to go to the moon. And that for all of their information, they had very little true knowledge or very little true wisdom. And of course, Roland says that's nonsense. Like babies from frozen man sperm, that's ridiculous. And the point is, and that piece of it right there sticks with me when I think about what you said, and I think it's very cogent, so I keep revisiting it. I think about what you said about, the internet and giving us information and all this, but very little genuine knowledge, much less wisdom. And that's the much larger thing I think that we chase here is why do you capture wisdom? And I think the wisdom is buried in the books, but you have to be stolid like the gunslinger to go through it. And I think we're trying to weed that out of people because I think there are forces in this world that don't want that. But I also think that sort of stubborn, nose to the grindstone persistence, to your point, isn't really valued when I could just go hire the hot girl.
There's a guitarist. He actually lived down in the Austin area. His name's Tim Eckler, I believe. He's in a band called Polyphia.
Okay.
He is an alien on the guitar. And he talks about, like, in interviews, like, how did you develop your technique? And he goes, well, it all started off because I just wanted to flex on the guitar with all the cool stuff I could do. So the problem with that is you don't really learn anything because you're just trying to impress. He said, so I may have been able to do these technically advanced movements, but in application, it didn't really have much because there was no theory to apply the skills. And so he said, once he realized this, he got nervous because he's like, I have a ton of work to do. I have to backfill all of this information because I know it's not going to be given to me. And I feel like is that you're because of the immediacy and because things, the idea of working for something it has become a more foreign, I don't know, concept, or especially in like application. I mean, I think that's what why job markets are so volatile right now. It's like people are like, yeah, I get a job, and you get there and you're like, and it's not what, there was a breakdown the entire time. So
I think that COVID, I'm sorry, the unnamed virus of unknown origin, that came from nowhere and did nothing. I think that entire situation that we wound up in exacerbated some things that were already lying underneath the surface of American society and society in the West overall. But I do fundamentally believe that a literature / philosophy / leadership / management podcast can actually help save Western civilization. I do believe that.
I do. Here's the crazy thing, man. And I've always loved like you're the path you're on and that you've taken to get there. It's been fantastic and like awesome to watch. And I am experiencing like the breakdown in communication and what it actually means to be a leader on a daily basis. And it's a grind, man. It's a grind because there is this sort of like commitment to excellence and also a truth on some level.
Mm-hmm.
So if no one is playing in that field, everyone sort of like has like Jordan Peterson talks about, the investment and outcome.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if I do X, Y will happen. And so if anything is, so it's a zero sum game, because you're jockeying for position.
Yeah.
And anyone and everyone run over anyone and everyone to get to the next thing.
Yeah. Let's move forward a bit. A lot of different things happen. We're going to move forward a little bit. We're going to jump around here in The Hobbit. I would encourage you to pick up a copy of it, pick up your copy of it from your local bookstore. Add to that 600 million sold. It will be worth your time. Read it with your kids, by the way, particularly if your kids don't like reading. Just read a couple of pages at a time. It'll take you a year to read through the book. They'll go on an adventure. It'll be amazing. So we're going to skip forward over quite a few things, quite a few pieces of the adventure, including the meeting of the dwarves, which there are dwarves. There's about 13 of them, led by a fellow named Thorin Oakenshield, and we'll go into the dwarves in a little bit. But I want to talk about what the dwarves are pursuing, because there's a link here between what Ryan has talked about in the acquisition of knowledge, and what I've mentioned also as well, but in the acquisition of knowledge without really having to earn it. And it's in this pursuit of gold, or in some cases, to paraphrase from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the ecstasy of gold, which, by the way, my 6-year-old son loves that song, by the way. Chapter 12. So we're going to go to chapter 12. Inside information. And we're going to pick up with we're going to pick up with some things happening to Bilbo here. For a long time, the dwarves stood in the dark before the door and debated, until at last Thorin spoke. Now is the time for our esteemed Mr. Baggins, who has proved himself a good companion on our long road, and a hobbit full of courage and resource far exceeding his size, and if I may say so, possessed of good luck far exceeding the usual allowance. Now is the time for him to perform the service for which he was included in our company. Now is the time for him to earn his reward. You are familiar with Thorin's style on important occasions, so I will not give you any more of it, though he went on a good deal longer than this. It certainly was an important occasion, but Bilbo felt impatient. By now he was quite familiar with Thorin too, and he knew what he was driving at. If you mean you think it is my job to go into the secret passage first, O Thorin, Thrain's son, Oakenshield, may your beard grow ever longer, he said crossly. Say so at once and have done. I might refuse. I've got you out of 2 messes already, which were hardly in the original bargain, so that I am, I think, already owed some reward. But third time pays for all, as my father used to say, and somehow I don't think I shall refuse. Perhaps I have begun to trust my luck more than I used to in the old days. He meant last spring before he left his own house, but it seems centuries ago. But anyway, I think I will go and have a peep at once and get it over. Now, who's coming with me? He did not expect a chorus of volunteers, so he was not disappointed. Philly and Killy looked uncomfortable and stood on one leg, but the others made no pretense of offering, except old Balin, the lookout man, who was rather fond of the Hobbit. He said he would come inside at least, and perhaps a bit of the way too, really to call for help if necessary. The most that can be said for the dwarves is this. They intended to pay Bilbo really handsomely for his services. They had brought him to do a nasty job for them, and they did not mind the poor little fellow doing it if he would. But they would have all done their best to get him out of trouble if he got into it, as they did in the case of the trolls at the beginning of their adventures, before they had any particular reason for being grateful to him. There it is. Dwarves are not heroes, but calculating folk with a great idea of the value of money. Some are tricky and treacherous and pretty bad lots. Some are not, but are decent enough people like Thorin and company, if you don't expect too much. The stars were coming out behind him in a pale sky barred with black when the hobbit crept through the enchanted door and stole into the mountain. It was far easier going than he expected. This was no goblin entrance or rough wood elves' cave. It was a passage made by dwarves at the height of their wealth and skill, straight as a ruler, smooth-floored and smooth-sided, going with a gentle, never-varying slope direct to some distant end in the blackness below. After a while, Balin bade Bilbo good luck and stopped where he could still see the faint outline of the door, and by a trick of the echoes of the tunnel hear the rustle of the whispering voices of the others just outside. Then the Hobbit slipped on his ring. Pause for just a moment. That's going to be a problem later. Just take note. Back to the book. And warned by the echoes to take more than a hobbit's care to make no sound, he crept noiselessly down into the dark. He was trembling with fear, but his little face was set and grim. Already he was a very different hobbit from the one that had run out without a pocket handkerchief from Baggins long ago. He had not had a pocket handkerchief for ages. He loosed his dagger in its sheath, tightened his belt, and went on. Now you are in for it at last, Bilbo Baggins, he said to himself. You went and put your foot right in it that night of the party. Now you've got to pull it out and pay for it. Dear me, what a fool I was and am, said the least tookish part of him. I have absolutely no use for dragon-guarded treasures, and the whole lot could stay here forever. If I could only wake up and find this beastly tunnel was my front hall at home. He did not wake up, of course, but still went on till all sign of the door behind him had faded away. He was altogether alone. Soon, he thought, it was beginning to feel warm. Is that a kind of glow I seem to see coming right ahead down there, he thought. It was. As he went forward, it grew and grew till there was no doubt about it. It was a red light, steadily getting redder and redder. Also, it was now undoubtedly hot in the tunnel. Wisps of vapor floated up and past him, and he began to sweat. A sound, too, began to throb in his ears, a sort of bubbling, like the noise of a large pot galloping on the fire, mixed with a rumble as of a gigantic tomcat purring. This grew to the unmistakable gurgling noise of some vast animal snoring in its sleep down there in the red glow in front of him. It was at this point that Bilbo stopped. Going on from there was the bravest thing he ever did. The tremendous things that happened afterward were as nothing compared to it. He fought the real battle in the tunnel alone before he ever saw the vast danger that lay in wait. At any rate, after a short halt, go on he did, and you can picture him coming to the end of the tunnel and opening of much the same size and shape as the door above. Through it peeps the Hobbit's little head. Before him lies the great bottommost cellar or dungeon hall of the ancient dwarves, right at the mountain's root. It is almost dark, so that its vastness can only be dimly guessed. But rising from the near side of the rocky floor, there is a great glow. The glow of Smaug. So we're going to talk extensively about dragons today. And I'll leave Smaug there, snoring atop his heap of gold for just a moment while I bring this up. So in the first 12 chapters of The Hobbit, you get a sense, because it's world building that Tolkien is really interested in, of the motivations of dwarves, elves, hobbits, and wizards. Now, let's sort of break these down a little bit for those of you who are uninitiated or who watched the overextended Peter Jackson films. By the way, Guillermo del Toro should have directed The Hobbit. It should have been a two-parter, and that would have been it. But New Line Cinema, much like Smaug, was greedy for gold. Kind of a problem.
Extended those two.
Oh, yeah. 3 movies was too much. What are we doing?
Longer than that.
Oh, my God. Not only longer than that. Anyway. There's barely enough there for 2 movies, much less 3. Anyhow, and everybody knew it. Even Peter Jackson knew it. Okay, that's my review of the movies. So Tolkien gave each race in Middle Earth their own personality, right? And so he talks a little bit about dwarves, who are greedy and brave, but also cowardly. Dwarves share a lot in common with humans. By the way, humans aren't extensively mentioned in The Hobbit. Suffice it to say, Gandalf does stand in for the humans, but Gandalf is a wizard, and that's a different thing.
Do we know how old Gandalf is?
So that's an excellent question. The Silmarillion hints that he's close to 800 or 900 years old. But, there's going to be Tolkienites out there that are going to yell at me because I got the number wrong. But it's somewhere in there. And there's also some indication or some intimation that Gandalf merely just appeared in the world along with the other 2 wizards. So there's also some intimation there that Gandalf might be ageless and it might not matter, in which case he's a totally different thing. But okay. Then of course you got the hobbits, who are fat and safe, and they live in a they live in a positive world, rather than a negative one, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. Then you've got the elves, and the hobbits visit the elves, or they at least stop at the elves uh sort of mm, their village, I guess, is the best term to use, although it's more like their civilization in chapter 3, A Short Rest. um hmm?
The kingdom.
Kingdom, civilization, place where they're all hanging out. I got to admit, I don't have much respect for the elves in The Hobbit. I'm more in Lord of the Rings, but I don't have a whole lot of respect for the elves. And the reason why is because the elves are your classic sort of, they're the Eloi from Time Machine that don't really want to know where their food comes from, which
Mhm.
makes them arrogant and kind of useless. And I think this was sort of a point that Tolkien was making as well. Um, they're intelligent, they're ethereal, and they float above it all. Always above it all, never daring to get down into the muck. But there are legends about when they did. And again, in the Silmarillion, in the first battles against Sauron, all the way to the edges of Mordor. Some of this is more fleshed out in Lord of the Rings. Again, The Hobbit is sort of an introduction to this. Um, and then, of course, you have wizards, which we already mentioned, Gandalf. Wizards are unique because they're the ones that get people motivated and get people moving. And they don't really care why people are moving. They would like motivations to be pure, but they'll take any motivations that they can get, because their job is to sort of, I think, be the catalyst in the world, be the way for the world to move on. Now, some wizards do this well, like Gandalf. Other wizards, like the one that was the head of the eagles and the birds, can't remember that wizard's name right now. Again, the Tolkienites will all get to me on this one. But some of them just sort of totally abandon what it is that they're doing and sort of fall into the natural world. And then you have other wizards, as we will see in the Two Towers here coming up in a couple of weeks. You have other wizards who throw in their lot with evil forces that they probably shouldn't throw in with. By the way, wizards always show up when the apocalypse is on the way, or when Armageddon is about to occur. And here's the thing: Armageddon is always on the horizon, in ways both large and small. But in The Hobbit, everyone's after the gold. Everyone's after the treasure. That's why I opened with this Statio d'Oro, right? It's this idea that gold is going to be the driver, and the dwarves really only care about wealth. They dig deeply and greedily, and their talents and skills are all oriented towards protecting their wealth and putting it in caves, sort of like the Benedictine option with some Christians. And so my question, to sort of get us started on this intellectual jog, Ryan, how can leaders avoid being seduced by wealth?
Before I did want to, so how to, I was working a job,
Yeah.
and a man came in with his daughter. His daughter was probably like 11 years old, 7, 8, 9, and I was kind of unsure what was going on, because he was standing away from her, but allowing her to walk through the restaurant and walk to the counter and order her food and pay using a card. And
Mm-hmm.
I watched the father observe, and she kind of like turned and looked, and it was this like really pure, beautiful moment where a father, a wizard, was teaching his,
Yeah.
hobbit, like, yeah, you can, he's like
Yeah,
that.
you can do it.
Very beautiful thing. And so that's like the kind of like piggyback on how to integrate. It's like people who see opportunities to do so, and carry that on for whoever is in need of that experience in that particular situation. His daughter, is I think a wonderful continuation of how to get people sort of engaged in the 3D actual world and continuation. But how to avoid being seduced by wealth is a lot of, I think, education and let's see here. I have outline in detail all forms of wealth, not in financial or acquisitional form, and the inherent interconnectivity of all system. When one system is off, it has not always a clear effect on the outcome. So years ago, my AA sponsor, Bob G, he got his pilot's license. He's fine, recreational pilot's license. And he was talking about his being in school and his training. And his instructor said, when a plane crashes, it's not like one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he proceeded to give me like all of the kind of instruments and devices and mechanics of the plane that weren't major ones, like a wing falls off.
Mm-hmm.
He said, but even like with that, if partial wing, he said, if one thing goes wrong, you can navigate around it. If two things goes wrong, you can navigate around it. It's like, but you start seeing like, all right, the landing gear is not coming down. You only have one propeller, and all your instruments have gone off. You're probably so it's that that wealth is not solely limited to kind of like a tangible. There's spiritual wealth. There's this like familiar and connectivity, social, and how strong I think these things are and these bonds are, because at some point, as we talked about prior to, so you get to in your 40s and 50s and you realize like, oh wow, the strength of not some realize it younger than older, but realize the quality of my life is congruent to the strength of my interpersonal relationships, and that paying attention to those things that I may have not have thought were that important because they weren't the cool thing or the sexy thing or the hip thing or any of those things has incredible value, immeasurable value, just because of how much small things, when compiled and sort of working towards that, like a balanced life, those things have great value. And it's like this, the sum of the parts are way greater than the individual ingredients. And I think wealth and the misunderstanding of wealth, just as a kind of a state or a concept, is like a lot of things. There's misunderstanding of that.
So this is the idea. There was a comic book writer and artist way back in the day, a guy named Dave Sim. Wrote a great comic book called Cerebus the Aardvark. You should go pick it up. The first independent comic that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Loved it for that reason. Dave Sim in the 1990s was involved in a whole lot of controversies in comic books because he was a big independent comic books publishing guy. He just was. And one of the things that he said was, if you go and work for Marvel Comics at the time, which was still an independent comic company before they got acquired by the Mouse House, or if you go work for DC Comics, which, DC's been owned by Warner Brothers since time out of mind. Okay. If you're going to go work for DC or Marvel, just know that you're exchanging the gold of your talent for the paper money of a few shekels. You're putting on golden handcuffs, in essence. And so the idea that you're talking about is this idea of gold versus paper money. In our day, we think information and technology is gold, but I'm beginning to wonder in my time if that really isn't paper money. If we've all just kind of been fooled by fiat currency, money that isn't backed by anything. And we all get to decide what the value of it is at any given moment, and values fluctuate. For instance, the value of the gold that's in your resume is worth more than the hotness that is paper money of that girl. Because that's going to fluctuate with the market. Sorry, ma'am, but it's going to fluctuate with the market. But your resume is gold. It's not going to fluctuate with the market. The dwarves in the Hobbit, they're not chasing paper money. They're chasing gold. But in their conception of the world, gold is paper money. they don't look at the work that they've done. They don't look at the efforts that they've put in. They look at all this past glory and this acquisition as being the thing. And it's almost, and J.R. Tolkien was a Christian. It's almost idolatry, right? It's almost the idol. And you mentioned Jordan Peterson, you know, he often says, and he's not wrong, what the biblical corpus will tell you, what the biblical corpus of those stories will tell you is that if you worship anything that's outside of the transcendent, it will judge you and you will always be found wanting. Period, full stop. You just will. In our time, how do we distinguish between what's really valuable, what's that you talked about, things that are really valuable, that stuff that's gold, right, from the paper money? And then second question, how do we convince people who aren't convinced? Because when I was in my 20s, heck, when you were in your 20s, I mean, like, we all thought we were chasing gold, but we weren't. We were chasing fiat currency. You were chasing paper money.
Yeah, or something, you know, very similarly represent, like something of equal,
Yeah,
perceived at the time.
right.
Um,
I know, big question. And part of it, maybe it's just age. Maybe you just have to go through a whole series of steps and a whole series of things. You have to have an adventure. You have to leave your hobbit hole, go out and have an adventure, get knocked around a little bit to recognize that difference.
I think the first thing I wrote down, the first thing I wrote down was patience. But it's a lot like, I don't know who said this, but it's like, you know, the genius is not in the idea, the genius is in the application.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has had a genius idea.
Yeah.
Everyone has been able to, Elon Musk is a great example. That is, you know, the high, that's the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
Like applying your ideas and having them to be successful. How do you know, how in this world does one not be affected by the precedent that is set as far as how the kind of like society has outlined that you kind of like should be? It's this really weird, like,
well, do you think the struggle has gotten harder? Or maybe the hardness has moved into a different spot. Maybe it was always hard.
I think there are a lot of, I think it is easier to acquire money and sustain oneself and live autonomously. And the resources have, even compared to 20 years ago, have kind of like exploded across the country just because of like that slave labor thing. It's like everything is, you know, when I was in Portland, this is 10 years ago, when I was in Portland, I was leaving a restaurant. I saw a couple homeless kids and they're like, hey, do you have any money? And I could see they were kind of on the street. And I was like, no, but you can have my leftover food. And they were like, no, we need to pay our cell phone bill. And it was like, what? You're panhandling for cell phone money? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, when you get to that disconnect, or right. Is that a problem? And so, like as all this, as society is unfolding, and it's just become kind of more confusing because the technology is advancing. The brain, technologies like this, the brain's like this. So it's
right.
It's like pulling away in the process of information. So, as somebody who is like out there trying to like make it and do it, and then you continuously see sort of like or experience things like this, and it's like I am like working my hind off. And it's a kind of persistent struggle, and then so it's how do you not compare? It's like it's in our face, and I don't know, shutting down social media, limiting your social media exposure, give yourself an hour a day. There's all kinds of like, if you look at it like, if you want to look at it as addiction, or if you want to look at it as working out or exercising particular muscles. I started working at this hemp shop, and like I learned about CBD, and how the person described it is like, well, don't think of like you're going to take CBD and you're going to feel a particular way. Like CBD, and if you're having stomach aches, bowel issues, body, fibromyalgia, inflammation. It's going to start taking things away. And so I think somewhere along the way, a lot of, people have confused, have mistaken, I don't, for a better term, but like the darkness for the light. And so I don't think those things are really measure out to like an accuracy or an accurate portrayal of actually what's occurring. So it's Eric Eric Weinstein talks about, and once you get to like the tertiary level of like convolution, your ability to process the information, determine reality becomes increasingly more difficult because you are 3 parts removed away from the actual event. And I mean, I actually haven't seen Inception, but from what I understand, Inception is kind of like, that's the deal. So and you know how hard it is to sort of follow that. So what like, as someone who is so if you're the person to not be so be an example. I mean,
Well, I think you hit on something also with patience, right? So years ago, Simon Sinek made this point. You can have anything you want right now, just ordering it up without consequence, right? So you can have food. If you want to order food, you can get it on DoorDash. If you want movies, you can get them on Amazon, you can get them on Netflix. I mean, my kids and I watched Super Mario Brothers movie the other day, right? Like my 6-year-old loved that, right? And I ordered it and boom, there it was, right? If you want to have a book, right, you get it next day delivery. You don't have to wait. Like if I wanted to order, I didn't do this, but if I wanted to order The Hobbit, I could have it within 24 hours, right? Not a problem. So there's this gap between even in more intimate relationships, right? Or intimate relations. If I go on Tinder, which I wouldn't, but I've heard rumors that, I swipe left, I swipe right, someone shows up to my house, boom, like I'm a stud. I don't have to like work through the whole like asking somebody something and then having them reject me, and then I'm going to deal with the rejection. I have to do that 30, 40, 50 times. I don't have to work that muscle because like, boom. Now, I do know that there's a moving past these dating apps because that's warped all kinds of different interpersonal relationships. I'm not even going to get into all that, but our technology hasn't really served our biology, and biology will out at the end of the day. It just will. Okay. So we have all these technologies, and you mentioned this several times, that can give us immediacy, right? That can close the gap between our desires and our wants and the material filling of those, with the exception of life satisfaction and meaning. All right, no app for that. Those are slow, painful, patience-driven processes, and we've confused our materialistic needs for meaning. And I don't know how we return back to a time when those two things were definitively separate and we knew the differences between those two things. And maybe we don't return back to it. Maybe it's a moving forward where those materialistic things are less emphasized and more of the things that Tolkien or Lewis, right, would engage around, or Shakespeare or whoever, which were more of the spiritual and emotional things, take more precedent. Now that sounds woojie and like Age of Aquarius, and I'm not that guy. I think there's very hard-headed, practical ways you can do that. But I think it's a really hard sell. And it's interesting that you opened up with this idea that, the genius is in the application, not the idea. The application is where the growth is. The application is where the patience is. And there's very few people who apparently, at least what I'm seeing, very few people who want to do the application. They just want the idea.
It's like lottery winners are probably way more susceptible to kind of like going broke than somebody who grew up in a single a lower class house with a
Right.
single parent and worked their hind parts off
Right.
to get everything that is, and so when you understand the cost
Mm-hmm.
and what it took to get there, it's, you know, you hold on for dear life. And
But if we don't understand the cost, so this is my concern. If we don't understand the cost, if too many of us don't understand the cost, then, and Tolkien did all of his writing coming out of World War One, and we kind of underestimate the power of that war, like how much that war shaped everything down until now. I mean, I've said this on the podcast before, but like our 20-year excursion into Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States went on and just like extricated ourselves from, that was all cleanup from the Ottoman Empire.
well, it's funny. So you're saying we're still, there's the aftermath of the Great Depression is still prevalent today. And not until you say this and outline these things do you see that there's, you know why? Because we see the cycles, we see it, and it's brought up all of the time. And
Right.
to see it has influence and continues to influence financial decisions. And yeah.
Well, I just saw the movie and we just did a review of it. Me and my other co-host Tom Libby, we just did a review of the movie Oppenheimer as a bonus to our conversation around the fall of the House of Usher, right? And I'm not going to talk. I mean, you can go back and listen to the review, listen to the bonus episode. I'm not going to get into that. However, what I will say is this: the number of deaths in warfare since World War II has dropped precipitously, like by a factor of 100 since the end of World War II. And this is not just like in wars the United States, quote unquote, started. I'm talking about everywhere across the planet. And it's because the application of the idea of atomic power that Einstein lamented. Oh, if I had known, I would have become a watchmaker. The application of that idea scared the hell out of everybody, like at an existential level.
Yeah, he also said, I don't know what weapons will be used to fight in World War III, but I know World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
That's right. The application of an idea. And because that has scared the hell out of all of us, which, by the way, it's interesting. We sort of took a vacation from that between like 1989 up until about 2021, when the Russians all did us a favor and brought up all those boogeymen again. Moved the Overton window, not forward, but backward. They moved the Overton window backward to the Cold War. And now the Russian boogeyman is all living underneath our beds with nukes. So like, we now, but we don't have the tools right now to deal with that existential dread. I mean, we barely had the tools during the time when the Cold War was going on for that 70-year long, as Ronald Reagan would have put it, twilight struggle. We barely had the existential and moral and ethical and religious tools to deal with that then. We have none of those tools now. We've thrown all that out in our postmodernism. We said we don't need those. And now all we have is just the fear. And my concern is that, in this sort of long rambling thought, is that books like The Hobbit or The Fall of the House of Usher, or we're going to be covering The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway later on this year. We've already covered Shakespeare this year. We've talked about, Black slave narratives, The Good Earth by Pearl Buck. In looking at these books, I think the solution to the existential dread is inside of these books. It's inside of these places. It's inside of these narratives, and we have to have the patience to circle around back to what you were talking about. We have to have the patience to go and explore inside of there. That's the part to me that I don't know how we get with the swipe left, swipe right culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the leadership that's so silly. But I mean, first and foremost, if it is, this is your mission.
Yeah, this is the thing I'm on. Yeah, this is the thing I'm on. Yeah.
And you're championing these concepts that are increasingly becoming like foreign, and how to impart that wisdom, and how to living righteously. And so everything is like, so many things in communication have become so broken down to the degree, and my personal situation right now is a great example of, like, we're not even talking about what we're talking about, that no party knows what is even the topic, and it's yelling into the void. And it's like, it's I don't know, like, it feels, I don't know, it just seems some sort of like brainwashing thing is it's.
Well, maybe it's the breakdown of mass communication. And we'll go back to the book here in just a second. Maybe it's the breakdown of mass communication, because I think there's something to be said for everybody gathering around the television with only 3 channels as a family, or like my mom grew up, where there was only one TV on the block. Like, I'll sometimes challenge younger groups or younger audiences, chronologically younger audiences. I'll say to them, imagine if I took away everybody's cell phone in this room and you all had to share one cell phone. And the look of horror that comes on everybody's face is undeniable. And it's a mixture of a look of horror with a look of just sort of, I can't even conceptualize what you just said to me. It's literal confusion. And so we went from a society where that idea of everybody watching one television show around a TV is not that much different than the family sitting around reading the newspaper or reading a novel out loud. Like, that's not a hard jump.
Yeah.
The big jump that we made in the 90s and in the early 2000s was going from everybody sitting around the TV to everyone having their own TV in their own pocket. That's a massive jump. Thank you, Steve Jobs. That's a massive jump. And that massive jump created societal disruption, because now I don't have to engage with you in the same space that you're communicating in. I don't have to accept your idea if I don't want to. I'm not compelled to listen to you. I'm also not compelled to resist you, but I'm also not compelled to accept you, right? And so we really focus on the resistance part of it, but I really think we should focus on the acceptance part of it. I'm not forced through social norming to accept your idea. Instead, I can go pick a bunch of ideas that I want to accept, go into the echo chamber there, have myself reinforced, and then come out of that echo chamber. And now I got to deal with all you nonsense people. And instead of dealing with you, I'm just going to be passive. And the classic example of this that we see now, or I see recently, and this is going to be an old man screaming from the tower kind of thing. I fully admit this, but like, I can't go into another customer service situation where you have your wireless iPhone earbuds in your ears and you're serving me you're providing me customer service. I can't do it. I'm sorry. I guess, yeah, okay, you're listening for your phone because nobody gives anybody a phone anymore. So like, you have to have your own phone if the owner wants to call you, or manager or whoever. I don't care. That sounds like a you problem, not a me problem. The me problem is I need to show up in that customer service experience at Staples or at the local vendor with you looking like you're actually paying attention to me. And if you've got an earbud in your ear, I know you're not listening to me. I know I'm not the most interesting thing happening to you in your life. And right now, at that moment, when I have the window, I want to be the most interesting thing happening to you.
Very rarely, it is increasingly difficult to remain in the present moment.
Well, not only that, it's increasingly difficult to acknowledge not only that the present moment is, forget being in the present moment, it's increasingly difficult to acknowledge the presence of another human being with a soul. Yes, I'm going to go there. With a soul and needs and emotions and ideas. I am not I'm not a tool to be used for you. Right? And this is why I go back to the hot girl. This is why the bartender can hire the hot girl rather than you. Because at least the hot girl the customer will pay attention to the hot girl. And by the way, this cuts both ways, by the way. So you've got rude customers, and increasingly, we saw this before COVID, but increasingly you were seeing rudeness of people in social in customer service situations where customers were treating employees like they were garbage. And you still see that. And so now now it's evened out. Now it's happening on both sides. Now we can both treat each other like garbage. Yay, we've advanced the civilization. We've moved us a step closer to utopia rather than a step closer to dystopia. And it's all our fault. And I'll admit it, I'm sometimes terrible with customer service people, but I'm more inclined to be terrible with them if they have an earbud in their ear.
I have to, man. If similarly been doing customer service the whole life, you know what I mean, and
yep.
You know, we're pretty kind people. The other day, I was unnecessarily rude to the lady at where I pay my rent. The lady working and I'm gonna go and I have to go make amends to her and apologize because it was like something happened in my life that I couldn't deal with. It very rarely happens, but it affected that particular moment. I unnecessarily treated a person unkindly, or not even unkindly, just terse and coarse, and it was uncalled for. Which made me think of like, because we were talking about like that fundamental absence or the fundamental difference in like how to like educate your brain at some point, and that's why it's such a big, because at some point it becomes like, oh, is this just propaganda?
Right.
Okay, this is how you talk to people. You know, can you imagine PSAs coming out all over the place? Like, this is how you engage, you know what I mean? Like it's like we've aged backward and become like children again because we've lost like the just decent the manners. Like and yeah.
Yes. Well, it's I can't remember what episode of the podcast it was, but we talked about, and I can't remember what book it was, it'll come to me in a minute, but we talked about the importance of politeness. It's sort of how even if I disagree with you, I still need to be polite. Now, these days, we chalk that up, or we say that such an attitude or a posture is a sign of white supremacy and should be thrown over. But I pull up short on that. I say being polite is white supremacy. Really? Really?
So simple things as politeness have become politicized and noted as a demarcation of hating another race is completely bananas.
It not only is it bananas, you talked about coarseness, or as my grandmother would use a word, uncouthness. It is a sign of a lack of couth. Now, I don't know what couth is, but I know you don't have it if you're treating people terribly. I also know that a society cannot long survive, not a civilization. Civilization will be fine, but a society cannot survive very long if interpersonal relationships at the furthest edges, like in a customer service situation, are driven by uncouthness and terseness and being impolite. And I know social media has made it seem like we're all in communities together, but you talk about propaganda, that's propaganda in and of itself. That's propaganda, by the way, pushed by Facebook. It's propaganda pushed by LinkedIn. It's propaganda pushed by Instagram. It's or Meta, or whatever the hell they're calling themselves. It's propaganda pushed by YouTube. You're not connected to those people. I've often said, like, I don't really care what, hotgirl65@yahoo.com has to say about my podcast. Like, I'm glad that person has an opinion, maybe, but like, I don't. Save your review, go bother someone else, because anonymity doesn't interest me. If you have any guts, you're going to put your name on it, because you're going to own it, right? And by the way, I've lived out that principle. Most of the things you see online, if you go Google my name, most of the things you'll see online, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent, I've put my name on it. I've said this before on this podcast. The vast majority of my tweets are probably objectionable to somebody, and they're all defensible, and I will apologize for none of them. And if you want to cancel me off of Twitter or X or whatever, okay, that's fine. I don't really care. I'm not high enough up on the ladder for you to pay attention to anyway. But like people don't understand that you have to not defend. Being polite is part of the lubrication of society. It's part of what makes things go forward. And by the way, the hobbits, this is something that you see because Tolkien was a student of language. That's what philology is. He understood the nature of what is hidden inside of the language of politeness. And it's more than just making things just run. It's also honoring. It's also elevating. It's also bringing people into a different kind of space. All these things are happening inside of language.
Well, you said he's an Oxford man. And so the politeness,
yes.
and listen, there was sort of like an allusion to that. And this is why, at least in my opinion, experience that something like this is someone having good and polite manners is not necessarily the end all and be all. However, if it is something that is culturally significant and has been represented through the population of the island of England, then you could also say that they're like the characteristics inherent in the Native American population. As far as the conversations that I had when I worked at a rehab, someone said to me once when we were having a conversation, and I said, I just noticed that you take a breath, and you kind of like you take a few seconds up to a minute to respond to my question. And they said, well, I'm thinking about how what's going to come out of my mouth is going to affect the next 3 generations of people. And so that is an aspect, that is a cultural. And so I think homogenizing can kind of like shave off any cultural, I don't know, say norms or practices or traditions or just, I don't know, personality or character. Similarly to the dwarves, love, you know what I mean? It's and so that's, I don't know if that's kind of like in the vein of, but it seems like culturally significant. And so I don't know.
Ryan's going to chew on this more, but we're going to go back to the book. Back to The Hobbit. We are reading the Ballantine Books edition, published in 1981 by Random House, published by an arrangement with Houghton Mifflin Company. So this is our version, or this is my version that we're reading from today. This version, by the way, also has a cover painting. Bilbo comes to the huts of the Raft Elves, that was by J.R.R. Tolkien, because he was also a painter and a little bit of a doodler as well. By the way, the Ballantine Books version of The Hobbit, the authorized edition of The Hobbit, has never been out of print since it was in print first in the 1930s. Okay, and so that's just something to note. 1937. So that's just something to note. By the way, this version also has maps in it, so you may want to take a look at that. And it has an introduction written by Peter S. Beagle from Watsonville, California. Some interesting things in that you may want to check out. All right, so we're going to go to chapter 2 here, roast mutton. This takes place just after um, Bilbo goes to sleep and gets up in the morning after all of the dwarves basically eat him out of house and home, and he's a little resentful. So we're kind of going back in time a little bit, way before the dragon and a whole bunch of other things. So Gandalf asks him this question. My dear fellow, said he, and this is Gandalf, whenever are you going to come? What about an early start? And here you are having breakfast, or whatever you call it, at 10:30. They left you the message because they could not wait. What message? Said poor Mr. Baggins, all in a fluster. Great elephant, said Gandalf. You are not at all yourself this morning. You have never dusted the mantelpiece. What's that got to do with it? I've had enough to do with washing up for 14. If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have found this just under the clock, said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, on his own notepaper. This is what he read. Thorin and Company to burglar Bilbo. Greeting. For your hospitality, our sincerest thanks, and for your offer of professional assistance, our grateful acceptance. Terms. Cash on delivery, up to and not exceeding 1/14 of total profits, if any. All traveling expenses guaranteed in any event. Funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or our representatives if occasion arises and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp, trusting that you will be punctual. We have the honor to remain yours deeply, Thorin and Company. That leaves you just 10 minutes. You will have to run, said Gandalf. But, said Bilbo. No time for it, said the wizard. But, said Bilbo again. No time for that either. Off you go. To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside without a hat, walking stick, or any money, or anything that he usually took when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half finished and quite unwashed up, pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands and running as fast as his furry feet could carry him down the lane, past the great mill, across the water, and then on for a whole mile or more. Very puffed he was when he got to Bywater just on the stroke of 11 and found that he had come without a pocket handkerchief. Bravo, said Balin, who was standing at the inn door looking out for him. Just then all the others came round the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of baggages, packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. There was a very small pony, apparently for Bilbo. Up you two, gut, and off we go, said Thorin. I'm awfully sorry, said Bilbo, but I have come without my hat, and I've left my pocket handkerchief behind, and I haven't got any money. I didn't get your note until after 10:45 to be precise. Don't be precise, said Dwalin, and don't worry. You will have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs, and a good many other things before you get to the journey's end. As for a hat, I've got a spare hood and cloak in my luggage. That's how they all came to a start, jogging off from the inn one fine morning just before May on laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him, and he looked rather comic. What his father Bungo would have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was that he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. They had not been very long when up came Gandalf, very splendid on a white horse. Pause here, by the way. In the book of Revelations, Jesus comes on a white horse. Just thought I'd point that out. Back to the book. He had brought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after that, the party went along very merrily, and they told stories or sang songs as they rode forward all day, except, of course, when they stopped for meals. These didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked them, but still he began to feel that adventures were not so bad after all. At first they had passed through Hobbit lands, a wild, respectable country inhabited by decent folk with good roads, an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or a farmer ambling by on business. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been good as may can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands they had to camp where they could, but at least it had been dry. To think it will soon be June, grumbled Bilbo as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. It was after tea time. It was pouring with rain and had been all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes. His cloak was full of water. The pony was tired and stumbled on the stones, and the others were too grumpy to talk. And I'm sure the rain has got into the dry clothes, into the food bags, thought Bilbo. Bother burgling and everything to do with it. I wish I was at home by my nice hole by the fire, with the kettle just beginning to sing. It was not the last time that he wished that. Notice of the Hobbit. Somewhere behind the gray clouds, the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark. Wind got up, and the willows along the riverbank bent and sighed. I don't know what river it was, a rushing red one, swollen with the rains of the last few days that came down from the hills and the mountains in front of them. Soon it was nearly dark. The winds broke up the gray clouds, and a waning moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper and where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on. Not until then did they notice that Gandalf was missing. So far, he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He had eaten most, talked most, and laughed most, but now he was simply not there at all. Just when a wizard would have been most useful too, groaned Dory and Nori, who shared the hobbits' views about regular meals, plenty and often. They decided in the end that they would have to camp where they were. So far, they had not camped before on this journey, and though they knew that they soon would have to camp regularly when they were among the misty mountains and far from the lands of respectable people, it seemed a bad wet evening to begin on. They moved to a clump of trees, and though it was drier under them, the wind shook the rain off the leaves, and the drip drip was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have gotten into the fire. Dwarves can make a fire almost anywhere, out of almost anything, wind or no wind, but they could not do it that night, not even Oin and Gloin, who were especially good at it. It is a dangerous thing to leave your house and go out on the road, Mr. Baggins. It's a dangerous thing to be hustled and bustled and pushed out. However, there are some things maybe we can take from Bilbo being shoved out the door. The first thing is a word of warning. So, when a wizard comes knocking, unless you want an adventure, don't go answering. Now, if the wizard picks you, particularly a wizard on a white horse, you may want to ask him some very salient questions. The other thing that we see in Tolkien, and he was notorious for this, again, he took ideas that he'd had in The Hobbit and concepts that he built in The Hobbit, and he put them on steroids in The Lord of the Rings. But we begin to see this idea that the landscape and the language and the people are all united as one. So if there are dark and evil tidings in the buildings, guarantee you they were built by dark and evil people. The roads get worse, the buildings get worse, the people get worse, the language gets rougher. We miss this in our scientifically material age, where we tend to separate the spiritual from the material, because if we can't see it, then it must not be there. But we do reflect, or the geography does reflect, our psychological makeup, whether we are comfortable with this idea or not. By the way, the path that Bilbo and the dwarves are going on before they meet the dragon and go and try to get the gold, the path that they're on is a path of malevolent evil. And Tolkien does a really good job of showing that atheistic nihilism has no answer for the challenges that evil represents. It really doesn't. And the more you're challenged by the existential geography around you, the more that impacts your spiritual nature. There's another theme that you see here that Tolkien begins to really push on in this chapter, and it's the idea that you got to leave your hidey hole, because salvation is individual and not collective. Now, he's really going to lean into this with Frodo, Bilbo's nephew, but the point is that when you go out your door, you're chasing salvation. You're chasing redemption. You're chasing something there, and you're the one that has to do it. Your mom can't do it for you. Your dad can't do it for you. Your family can't do it for you. At a certain point, you have to go out on the road on your own. And that road will be a path through chaos, despair, and danger. And you're going to need a guide. You're going to need a wizard. You're going to need a Gandalf. So, Ryan, how can leaders who are tasked with being Gandalf, How can they address the complexities of the journey of life? A journey that is sometimes has chaos, despair, and danger on it, but also has good times. And sometimes it's like war, where nothing happens for very, very long stretches, and boredom and ennui can sometimes set in. How do leaders guide their followers down these roads?
It's funny, and I'm not a social media person, but the first thing that popped into my mind um was tempering your output.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a Banksy exhibit, a couple months ago, and one of the quotes that he had stenciled, it's part of it. The exhibit was, "Be sure to take breaks so you don't quit," and that is a beautiful comment on the immediacy uh, issue that we're having as far as like that engagement. We were saying.
Mm-hmm.
And Gandalf is kind of embodies I'm the kind of the person who's leading this because I'm 800 years old. I've been there, done that. I'll help you guys out. It's tempered. It's paced. It's understanding your crowd, knowing your audience, understanding the environment, and being of service to the mission. And I think that is so we become of service to the fame, the glory, the money. We become of service, all these other things we talked about, or I mentioned as far as like the wealth. Wealth has all different faces, and I don't think we're necessarily. I think this is that pons asinorum is like, I think we say wealth, and in our minds, more often than not, it equates to like balance.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't like, I think that's what like we think, or what the goal is, or the intention is. If I have this, then I will be that. And I think balance is probably the thing that we're conflating with wealth. And it's like we probably want, a stable, tempered, even keel, healthy, uh, spiritually on some level, sound life, but it's masked as this other thing. I liked what what Tolkien does with the this is the human nature. Back to okay, be punctual, and then the very next it says, don't get. He says, no need to get hung up on details.
Right.
It's a lot of the complex learning how to fight. Learning how to fight. That's where that like take a break so you don't quit. That's what that kind of translates to me in all my relationships. Like the reason for the most part they've all ended because the person who I was engaged in some sort of argument with, neither of us had the skill. I'll keep it on myself. I did not have the skill or the ability, the want, the know-how, the desire, or whatever combination of all those things to learn how to navigate whatever the issue was at the time. And that is it's a major, a downfall of mine. It can be a little murky, and it affects me in a particular way. But and even so, also what Tolkien does is the time of distress. He takes a moment, much like the cram, and he says, "The beautiful sky and the moon, like." It's in the middle of this tumultuous thing where this character is conflicted with being outside of the most comfortable environment ever, his Hobbit hut, and out into the world, and coming to terms with all of these things that are happening simultaneously, converging once, and to not go mad. He says, "Look at that, the beautiful," and whether that's what it's in there, and also talked about the environment and how, there's like kind of like Eastern versus Western philosophies where you are your environment versus creating your environment. Now, I may have talked about this before because it's so powerful. Sam Quinones, writer, a journalist, wrote a book called, I think, Dreamland or Return to Dreamland or something like that. And it takes place in Ohio, and it's about the black tar heroin trade that was really prevalent in the early 2000s, really 2000s. and how they set up kind of like satellite dispatchers essentially in all these towns surrounding major cities, because the major cities were already occupied and taken care of by some sort of like mob or gang affiliation. And so he talks about Jalisco. Jalisco is a city or a state in Mexico, and Jalisco, that's where the black tar heroin basically comes from. Is Jalisco. Everyone in Jalisco works towards the black tar heroin trade. He said, the town that's next door, everyone there, he's like, it's really common with these towns in Mexico where everyone in town does the same thing. He said the neighboring town, they're all like general contractors. The neighboring town from that is everyone. There was just prostitutes and brothels, and so it's just it's evidenced in modern day. So it's not just Tolkien being playful with mythology. I mean, there's evidential.
Okay, so no, I see your point about people all working in this one industry. The other thing, or another thing that sort of jumps out to me about this, it's interesting that you mentioned sort of, I want to go back to something that you said before about Gandalf, basically sort of dismissing Bilbo's concerns, but got no time for that. But nope, no time for that either. Nope. And I do this to my kids all the time. But you get in the car, this car's leaving. And so it's this idea, Clint Eastwood has this idea that, and it's sort of brilliant, where when he works with actors, he'll do one take, maybe two, and then it's done, and then he moves right along to like the next sequence that he has to film. And his philosophy is, we've made it this far, let's not ruin it by overthinking. And that kind of goes along, but you can only get there. You can only get, number one, Clint Eastwood is in his 90s, but he's been directing this way pretty much ever since he was in his 30s or 40s. So he's had a long track record of this. This is just who he is. This is just how he works. That's it. But Gandalf represents that wisdom of knowing when to think and when to provide good counsel, knowing when to not overthink and just have the thing happen, and knowing how to front load the hard work, but also knowing, and it's interesting in this passage that we read, knowing when to disappear, right? Knowing when not to be around, because sometimes wisdom is not the best tool. Sometimes you just have to do the thing, right? You just have to walk the road, or experience the chaos, or have the rain drip on your dark green hood and have it suck for you. Like, you just have to do those things in order to have the experience, and no amount of wisdom at that moment is really going to be helpful. Gandalf doesn't do therapy. I think you could probably spray paint that on the wall of a subway somewhere. So when you talk about tempering your output in service to the mission, how far does that go as a leader, right? I think a lot of leaders struggle with this. I struggle with the concept of, I have all this experience, I want to give it to people because they need it. Like, I can see the needs everywhere, and it's like whack-a-mole with the needs. But there's very few people who may want to hear it. So how do you know where that line is?
And well, that is the wisdom component. It's interesting, and we kind of like touched on it earlier, is in reference to the immediacy of the internet, every bit of information you could ever want in your pocket, and because lots of systems, institutions have been exposed, and as far as corruption, it's odd because there are leaders in place, or at least figureheads, and they're put in that position as to sort of like represent and lead, but not everyone is going to do that. For instance, I mean, I'm sure Jeffrey Epstein was the leader of his, and so some missteps, I guess, maybe, but in the same sense, the person who there's a person at the market who sells spices, and they started off at a little table as a vendor, and over time they built this spice business, and it moved indoors, and they did all the legwork. And so at one point you have to look and is that person's intentions to lead? Are they, it's like people have been put in place, and it's almost at times I think arbitrarily whether kind of like the populace allows them to do their job. So you can put somebody in a position to do something and then sabotage them every step of the way because of all these other conflicts that are not necessarily relevant to what the actual mission or task is at hand. Because then it becomes like a personality or a characteristic or a trait thing rather than a skill in applying the skill, whereas the application versus the idea. And so sometimes you can not even give people the opportunity to apply their wisdom because of these other reasons, which have completely truncated the individual from doing so.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say Jeffrey Epstein was a leader. Well, no, I wouldn't necessarily say Jeffrey Epstein was a leader. However, I do see your point. No, I do see your point. In that there's going to be people are going to lead from different motives, right? Whether you're building a spice business starting from scratch, or you are
he started from scratch too. It just was a different
you're operating or whether you're operating a an island with a bunch of shady corrupt people on it. There's going to be some standard frameworks there, right? And the standard frameworks are going to be power, position. Those are going to be standard, right? Influence is going to be there. Those are going to be some pillars that are going to be just going to be there, right? Because of the nature of just sort of what you're taking on, right? And I think Gandalf represents the ability to navigate those pillars with and this is the difference between Jeffrey Epstein and the Spice Guy, with ethics, right? With a moral foundation that comes from somewhere. We never find out truly where Gandalf's moral foundation comes from, but I do think that the allusions to Jesus, the allusions to the transcendent that are made by, and by the way, riding on the white horse is not the only one. I mean, there's several other ones that are in the Hobbit, and then later on Lord of the Rings, where it's undeniable that this is the direction that Tolkien is going in. Kind of show us where he's basing his where his moral and ethical anchor lies. Okay. I think that's really hard to determine for people, right? But it's also really hard to determine for leaders. And we talked about this a couple months ago. Where's your moral compass, right? And I think the other dynamic that you see in The Hobbit is the dynamic of Gandalf being the adult in the room. And that is something I think that we're missing in modern society. And the adult in the room is, well, and you and I have talked about this before. These days the barrier to entry to being the adult in the room is not that high to jump over. It's showing up competently, not complaining, doing the work for like 90 days straight, and then all of a sudden, congratulations, you're in charge.
I have a question to ask you because I've experienced this, and I know for certain that you've experienced this as well. And I don't know in what form, but you're just someplace and someone behaves in a particular way, and they're testing what the norm is of that, of the social norm in that group.
Oh yeah.
And whether it's flicking a cigarette butt, right? And then as soon they do that, and then they look at you as if to defer.
Right.
Was that bad what I just did? It happens. I'm sure you've experienced it. I've
Oh, yeah.
experienced it all of the time. Where yeah.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so interesting where it's like you turn to for and so that's when so about the wisdom. This I don't have I don't have money. I don't have any of those things. But why are you still looking at me like that? Do you know what I mean? I have
Well,
zero value to consider, but in this very like, yeah, please.
it's because you're the adult in the room in that moment. Congratulations, you're the adult. And by the way, I see this in rooms with because you know I have kids, so I go to a lot of places with other people with kids. That's just sort of the nature of the game. And you know, you'll be in a room with a bunch of parents. Some kid's parent will get out of control, or some kid will do something. This is usually how it happens. Some kid will do something, some kid will get out of control. And now all of the other parents, it's very subtle how this happens, even more subtle than the cigarette butt flicking thing, because that's more public. And particularly like in the place where I live in Texas, where we've been having a drought for the last like 3 months, somebody flicks a cigarette butt, someone's gonna get clapped. Like it's gonna happen. Like because we're not bound to wildfires this summer. So, and by the way, everybody in Texas, at least in the area of Texas I live in, has permission to clap that person. And they know they have permission to get clapped. And so, like, you know, so everybody knows sort of what the situation is, right? But it's way more subtle when you're in a situation with parents and kids, because the kid will get out of control. And I'm not going to let my kid get out of control. But now I'm looking at sort of my wife to see like how far can I go with this kid, right? Now, if my wife happens to be there, if my wife is not there, which is very rare, but this has happened. If my wife is not there and it's me and my kid, I'll literally look at that kid and I'll go, you need to stop. And then I'll watch the parent, usually it's a mom. I'll watch the mom to see what the mom will do. And if the mom does nothing and goes, that's fine, then like I'm off to the races on that kid. I'm off to the races. I'm not saying I'm disciplining the kid, but like, you know, I'm correcting social behavior, right? I'm doing it kind of funny and jokey and all that. Anyway, so I made the kid cry, right? And again, not to the point of like to be malicious, but it's the social norm thing. And then I've had the parent come back to me later on and be like, "Thank you for like social norming my kid." Now, occasionally, I will be in situations, and this is at the opposite end of that, where just there's something in the mood of the room where you know not to say anything to that kid because the parent's going to be a real problem. Not the kid, but the parent's going to be a real issue. And honestly, speaking of geography, I experience this more in the Northeast than I ever have, you know, in the currently where I live in the Southwest. And so I think it's regional to a certain degree. But yeah, I know what you're talking about. It is that sort of, hey, you're looking at me. Hey, I got to fix this problem now. And you're looking around going, who, me? Like I'm the one that's got to do this. And it is part of the Gandalf like journey of wisdom, I think, towards something better.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people won't even like know my story, but short period of time, it's like, this person's kind of been through it.
Right. Right.
It's, you know, it's kind of like this weird earned kind of status that I'm often unaware of.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, back to the book. We're rounding the corner. Back to the book. Back to The Hobbit. Or there and back again. So we're going to go back and pick up again in chapter 12. And we're going to talk a little bit about dragons. The dwarves were still passing the cup from hand to hand and talking delightedly of the recovery of their treasure, when suddenly a vast rumbling woke in the mountain, and underneath, as if it was an old volcano that had made up its mind to start eruptions once again. The door behind them was pulled nearly to and blocked from closing with a stone, but up the long tunnel came the dreadful echoes from far down in the depths of a bellowing and a trampling that made the ground beneath them tremble. And then the dwarves forgot their joy and their confident boasts of a moment before and cowed down in fright. Smog was still to be reckoned with. It does not do to leave a live dragon out of your calculations if you live near him. Dragons may not have much real use for all their wealth, but they know it to an ounce as a rule, especially after long possession, and Smog was no exception. He had passed from an uneasy dream in which a warrior, altogether insignificant in size, but provided with a bitter sword and great courage, figured most unpleasantly, to a doze, and from a doze to wide waking. There was a breath of strange air in his cave. Could there be a draught from that little hole? He had never felt quite happy about it, though it was so small, and now he glared at it in suspicion and wondered why he had never blocked it up. Of late, he had half fancied he had caught the dim echoes of a knocking sound from far above that came down through it to his lair. He stirred and stretched forth his neck to sniff. Then he missed the cup. Thieves, fire, murder! Such a thing had not happened since he first came to the mountain. His rage passes description, the sort of rage that is only seen when rich folk that have more than they can enjoy suddenly lose something that they have long had but have never before used or wanted. Pause. That's some wisdom right there. Continuing on, his fire belched forth. The hall smoked. He shook the mountain roots. He thrust his head in vain at the little hole, and then, coiling his lengths together, roared like a thunder underground. He sped from his deep lair, through its great door, out into the huge passages of the mountain palace, and up towards the front gate, to hunt the whole mountain till he had caught the thief and had torn and trampled him was his one thought. He issued from the gate. The waters rose in fierce whistling steam, and up he soared, blazing into the air, and settled on the mountain top in a spout of green and scarlet flame. The dwarves heard the awful rumor of his flight, and they crouched against the walls of the grassy terrace, cringing under boulders, hoping somehow to escape the frightful eyes of the hunting dragon. There they would have all been killed if it had not been for Bilbo. Once again, quick, quick, he gasped. The door, the tunnel, it's no good here. Roused by these words, they were just about to creep inside the tunnel when Bifur gave a cry. My cousins, Bomber and Bofur, we have forgotten them. They are down in the valley. They will be slain, and all our ponies too, and all our stores lost, moaned the others. We can do nothing. Nonsense, said Thorin, recovering his dignity. We cannot leave them. Get inside. Now, you others, where are the ropes? Be quick. Those were perhaps the worst moments they had been through yet. The horrible sounds of Smog's anger were echoing in the stony hollows far above. At any moment, he might come blazing down or fly whirling round and find them there near the perilous cliff's edge, hauling madly up the ropes. Up came Bofur, and still all was safe. Up came Bomber, puffing and blowing while the ropes creaked, and still all was safe. Up came some tools and bundles of stores, and then the danger was upon them. A whirring noise was heard. A red light touched the points of standing rocks. The dragon came. They had barely time to fly back into the tunnel, pulling and dragging in their bundles, when Smog came hurtling from the north, licking the mountainsides with flame, beating his great wings with a noise like a roaring wind. His hot breath shriveled the grass before the door and drove in through the crack they had left and scorched them as they laid hid. Flickering fires leaped up and black rock shadows danced. Then darkness fell as he passed again. The ponies screamed with terror, burst their ropes, and galloped wildly off. The dragon swooped and turned to pursue them, and was gone. That'll be the end of our poor beast, said Thorin. Nothing can escape Smog once he sees it. Here we are, and here we shall have to stay, unless anyone fancies tramping the long open miles back to the river with Smog on the watch. It was not a pleasant thought. They crept further down the tunnel, and there they lay and shivered, though it was warm and stuffy, until dawn came pale through the crack of the door. Every now and again through the night, they could hear the roar of the flying dragon grow and then pass and fade as he hunted round and round the mountainsides. He guessed from the ponies and from the traces of the camps he had discovered that men had come from the river and the lake and had scaled the mountainside from the valley where the ponies had been standing, but the door withstood his searching eye, and the long, high-walled bay kept down his fiercest flames. Long he had hunted in vain, till the dawn chilled his wrath, and he went back to his golden couch to sleep and to gather new strength. He would not forget or forgive the theft, not if 1,000 years turned him to smoldering stone, but he could afford to wait. Slow and silent, he crept back to his lair and half closed his eyes. Now, I'm going to skip forward a little bit Bilbo is now tasked with going and visiting the dragon. So I'm going to move forward a little bit. The sun was shining when he started, but it was dark as night in the tunnel. The light from the door almost closed, soon faded as he went down. So silent was his going that smoke on a gentle wind could hardly have surpassed it, and he was inclined to feel a bit proud of himself as he drew near the lower door. There was only the faintest glow to be seen. Old Smog is weary and asleep, he thought. He can't see me and he won't hear me. Cheer up, Bilbo. He had forgotten or had never heard about the dragon's sense of smell. It is also an awkward fact that they keep half an eye open watching while they sleep, if they are suspicious. Smog certainly looked fast asleep, almost dead and dark, with scarcely a snore more than a whiff of unseen steam when Bilbo peeped once more from the entrance. He was just about to step out onto the floor when he caught a sudden thin and piercing ray of red from under the drooping lid of Smog's left eye. He was only pretending to sleep. He was watching the tunnel entrance. Hurriedly, Bilbo stepped back and blessed the luck of his ring. Then Smog spoke. Well, thief, I smell you and I feel your air. I hear your breath. Come along, help yourself again. There is plenty and to spare. But Bilbo was not quite so unlearned in dragon lore as all that, and if Smog hoped to get him to come nearer so easily, he was disappointed. No, thank you, O Smog the Tremendous, he replied. I did not come for presents. I only wish to have a look at you and see if you were truly as great as tales say. I did not believe them. Do you now? Said the dragon, somewhat flattered, even though he did not believe a word of it. Truly, songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality, O Smog, the chieftest and greatest of calamities, replied Bilbo. You have nice manners for a thief and a liar, said the dragon. You seem familiar with my name, but I don't seem to remember smelling you before. Who are you and where do you come from, may I ask? You may indeed. I come from under the hill, and under the hills and over the hills my paths led, and through the air I am he that walks unseen. So I can well believe, said Smog, but that is hardly your usual name. I am the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number. Lovely titles, sneered the dragon, but lucky numbers don't always come off. I am he that buries his friends alive and drowns them and draws them alive again from the water. I come from the end of a bag, but no bag went over me. These don't sound so credible, scoffed Smog. I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles. I am ring winner and luck wearer, and I am barrel rider, went on Bilbo, beginning to be pleased with his riddling. That's better, said Smog, but don't let your imagination run away with you. I'm just a fly in the ointment, Hans. I'm just a fly in the ointment. I believe that John McClane once said that. Stuck in an elevator shaft, or it might have been an air conditioning shaft somewhere in some airport at some point back in the day. Monkey in the wrench. That's it. I am the thing that bothers you. Or to update it a little bit for the times in which we live now, I am the one who knocks. I'm not the one who gets got. I'm the one who does the getting. Dragons are a dangerous thing. Tolkien makes an excellent point when after the dragon realizes that, of course he's been ripped off. And by the way, not ripped off of a large thing, but ripped off of a small thing. He realizes that, I love this line. His rage passes description, the sort of rage that is only seen when rich folk that have more than they can enjoy suddenly lose something that they have long had, but have never before used or wanted. What an amazing observation of wealth in our time, as well as Tolkien's. Turns out the human nature is just the same back then as it is now. And yes, I'm looking at you, Sam Bankman-Fried, and all the people who took meetings with him while he was playing video games on his Xbox down in the Caribbean somewhere. Look, exactly. Dragons represent evil and chaos in many fantasy novels, myths and legends, and folklore throughout history. George R.R. Martin wrote about dragons in his fantasy novels, but dragons also serve as the stand-in, and many people don't realize this. It took a little bit of finagling for me to sort of comprehend this, but dragons also serve as a stand-in for the serpent in the Garden of Eden, thus guarding the gold of knowledge, right? Um, they are the thing that deceives, and this is what Tolkien was going towards with Smaug. Dragons also stand in psychologically for the negative emotions, anxiety, depression, anger, and so on, that exist at the upper boundaries of psychological openness and psychological neuroticism, all that sensitivity to negative emotions. As we turn the corner here, we had a long conversation and we've ranged across a number of different topic areas here that I think are applicable for leaders. But Ryan, how do we deal with dragons? How do leaders prepare followers to face the dragons that are in their workplaces, that are in their lives? Because there's dragons everywhere, mostly psychological. No one's being threatened by a giant serpent these days. But my kids even like dinosaurs. And it's interesting. Kids know this even better than adults do. Like, think about every 4-year-old you've ever met who can pronounce the name of Tyrannosaurus Rex, but has no idea how to identify depression or anxiety, right? Or dreams that children will have, where they are knights fighting dragons. In some cases, they defeat the dragon, but sometimes the dragon defeats them. Or even kids' stories, that are oriented towards children, myths and legends, where there's always a dragon that has to be beaten. There's something we're trying to tell our children here with this idea. But as adults, we sometimes forget it, or we gussy it up in sophisticated language. So how can leaders prepare their followers to beat the dragon, to face the Smaug?
I've got some notes here. And the first thing I wrote was get a dragon, show them the dragon, and then watch the movie How to Train Your Dragon.
I did watch that movie actually recently with my kids, actually.
Uh, so I was watching an interview. It might have been like Zach Galifianakis.
Okay. Between Two Ferns.
No, not Zach Galifianakis. It was somebody who was like maybe a low level or entry level fame in Hollywood person, and at Zac Efron's house. And this is probably years ago, and so he's like, "Hey, look." Zac Efron was like, "This is." This was Jimmy Page's first guitar, Les Paul, that he recorded Stairway to Heaven with.
Mm-hmm.
And the person was like, "Do you play guitar?" And he's like, "No." And he said, "Well, why do you have that guitar?" And he looked at him and he said, "I have everything. You don't understand. I have everything." And like, if that's not kind of the embodiment of kind of Smaug,
Yeah.
and that hoarding, and I don't know, the one I opened, and I like how riddles were like used as this some sort of like of validation.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could outwit someone, at the bridge, to pass, or in the to earn your, and that's the thing, like to earn your life,
Mm-hmm.
to earn an opportunity to further this interaction beyond me destroying you.
Well, Smaug wanted to play a game, right? Yeah, he wants to rip and tear and destroy and do all those other things, but he's layered and complicated. He's not one dimensional. He's not a unidimensional Marvel villain. He's got motivations. He's got needs. He's got desires. They are evil, but they are needs and desires. And it's interesting because Gandalf and Smaug don't have any interaction with each other. And I find that part to be fascinating.
Do you think that they would just look at each other and go, "Well, all right, yeah." Like,
I think it's one of those things where okay, I'll frame it this way. There used to be a time, not so much anymore, where even criminal people recognized that there were fundamentally good people out there that were going to show up to defeat them at some point. So the big example that I'll use is Hitler and Churchill. Hitler despised Churchill and Churchill despised Hitler. But Hitler respected Churchill for not bending the knee in the Battle of Britain. Matter of fact, Hitler respected Churchill more than he respected Stalin. He would have done a deal with Churchill, for sure, but he understood why Churchill wasn't. He just thought Stalin was venal, right? Evil being evil, right? And making a deal with evil, right? You're going to stab each other in the back, right? But good, even imperfect good, which is going to always be imperfect good, but imperfect good with a moral, with a backbone, it's just like, no, this is just like not going to be the thing. We're just not going to do the dance this way. You can respect that. I think that's what you would see with Smaug and Gandalf. Like, we're going to do a dance, but it's not going to work out the way you think it is.
Yeah. It's Greg Maddox versus Tony Gwynn. Tony Gwynn took five-time three-time Cy Young Award winner Greg Maddox.
Yep.
Tony Gwynn batted something like 460 against Greg Maddox. So when you get, you're talking about the creme de la creme against the creme de la creme. And yeah, ego and your accomplishments will take you so far, but when you're standing in that room, you still gotta and understanding this is the Smaug is it's competition.
Mm-hmm.
You see, and it's the competition is engaging.
Well, and you see this later when Gandalf fights the Balrog in the Fellowship of the Ring. This was dramatized, of course, in the movie. And then later he returns in the Two Towers, so you see this later on in Lord of the Rings, but there was no relativism inside of Gandalf. And just like there was no relativism inside of Smaug. Like, Smaug would play games with you all day, but there was no relativism inside of him. There was no sort of, oh yeah, I'm just going to let that slide. No, there's a principle here. And I think in our time, the current time in which we live, we admire uncompromising people, but the vast majority of us are too much in our hobbit holes to be pushed and have made too many compromises to stay in our hobbit holes to go into that uncompromising space, because being uncompromising requires sacrifice. And usually the sacrifice is people won't like you. That's usually what it is in our day. You might be unlikable, or you might be shut out from some social benefit. And by the way, I love it how you mentioned earlier about like not being online, not being in social media too much, and taking a break from all that, the Banksy idea, because then you're not made by that thing, right? Thus it cannot break you.
It's serving this thing that is serving a concept, or what's the value doesn't, like what you put, it doesn't equate, right. Or it often cannot, because of the detrimental consequences.
There's an idea here that we'll explore more as we go more into Lord of the Rings over the course of the next month. We're going to leave Gandalf here, and we're going to leave Smaug here, because there's another bigger dragon that even Smaug serves, a red wreathed eye in Mordor, It's just sort of hanging out in the background. That guy's going to be a problem. But just like there is one analogy I will make. So Smog perches at the top of the Misty Mountain, right? Searching and searching and searching. And yet he cannot find the hobbits. He cannot find the there is an idea in our time that evil is so all-encompassing that ultimately evil will win, or at the very minimum, passivity towards evil is the best response to it. Because of course it's going to win, because it's all-seeing, right? It's all-encompassing. This is the idea of all-encompassing totalitarianism, right? We saw some of this in some places during COVID, right? You might as well just put the mask on, or just go do the lockdown, or do whatever, right? Because, well, the government's going to get you anyway, because the all-seeing eyes are there. By the way, the eyes that are on your phone, the eyes that are in the CCTV cameras that are on every street corner now, the eyes that are in the private cameras that are in businesses. There's eyes everywhere, and the all-seeing eye of the Mordor of government is going to see you and somehow get you. Or the all-seeing eye of Smog perched at the top of the Misty Mountain. And yet, there's something here to know. Smog didn't find the hobbits or the dwarves. Now, you can argue that's because they hid. Okay. But Sauron didn't spot Frodo either. There's a message here that Tolkien is giving to us. It's a message to all the hobbits and the wizards and the good people. And we'll pull more of that apart as we go further into this month. Final thoughts on staying on the path. What can leaders take from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit that they can apply to their real lived lives, Ryan, as we turn the corner here?
I mean, the thing that pops into my head is, and it's very difficult to do, and that's how we're at this. This could be seen as an impasse as far as these like fundamental things, and is, I mean, if you're, you know, I've written down that's like authenticity, like being true to your mission statement, checking your motives. You know, one of the other things I wrote on here was the importance of sensitivity training, like equine therapy or bovine therapy. And I think the answer, like the answer, I don't know the details, but I have a feeling that it's like it is a growth mindset and one of inclusion rather than one of closed-mindedness and exclusivity. And that's what I said about the tempering, whether it's your output of whatever you're creating, or even because, I mean, imagine if you told your child everything that you're going to tell them their entire life, instead of telling them over the course of 3 to, death, is you just sit them down when they're like 9 and you just lay it all out and you go, you got it, right? All right. Don't ever say daddy didn't do anything for you. Good luck. And that's it. Hey, I didn't tell you. It's like, wait a minute, what are we doing here? So right. Setting people up for success, understanding the pitfalls, the complexities of figure out what your own deficiencies are. And that's usually a pretty good place to start. Having people that you value in your life and say, hey, listen, I mean, we've had conversations before and after all of these podcasts. And at least during all those conversations, there's a bit of information that is very relevant to what's happening presently in my life. And if I get relief and insight. And so the ability and willingness to remain teachable and also learnable, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. because I had another friend in AA who was a DA in New Jersey, and he said he brings he never wants to he said always gives everyone 2% because he never wants to be in a situation where he thinks he knows the end all and be all. So he gives everyone 2% because I might be wrong. And so when we kind of cut off the possibility of being incorrect about something, that's like an absolutism and certainty. And we know when certainty comes into any sort of philosophical equation that it is really, really dangerous, a slippery slope. And I think understanding all those complexities and the mental makeup of individuals, and like teasing out and kind of like mastering your own mind before you kind of help people engage with theirs in a way that's most productive for the mission.
I think that's a good place to stop. I'd like to thank Ryan for coming on our podcast today to talk about The Hobbit, kicking off our big month of science fiction and fantasy. This month we'll be covering Ender's Game. We'll be talking about all of the Lord of the Rings books. So we'll be covering the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and of course, Return of the King. We'll be doing that with a plethora of guest co-hosts. And so I want to thank Ryan for kicking us off for this month. And with that, and by the way, this is the last time that Ryan will be appearing on the podcast this season, this year, of the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. So we're rounding the corner here, getting ready to begin season 3 of the podcast next year. And he'll be hopefully willing to appear next year. Kind of like Wes Anderson. I had somebody compare this podcast to a Wes Anderson film one time where I have all my cast of players and I'm sort of directing everybody and pulling all the strings. It's not nearly that clean, folks. Just know. But Ryan will be appearing next year with a whole new stack of books that we will encourage him to talk about. So I want to thank him for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it.
And endless thank yous as well. And the complexities, and to kind of tag that last closing is, surrounding yourself with people who encourage growth, and because it's very difficult to I've experienced lots of people who are natural born learners and thirst for that, and mine is more of a struggle, and I find it much easier and conducive to that, which I feel is like the most beneficial way to occupy my mind and integrate into society as we know it, is to do my best to surround myself with those people, optimistic people who have growth mindset, and people who have like just a genuine interest to get to the bottom of it, whatever it is. And so with all that, remember to rest.
And well, we're out. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos? You don't like training? but you really like the podcast, well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.